Hi, my name is Butch Delaney, and I want to welcome you to the new Bible series, I'll Bet You Didn't Know. It will be a series of about 12 or 13 lessons from the Bible that have a different twist from other Bible lessons you may have heard. Today's lesson will be about a rock that moved and followed people. Now, all my life, I've been involved as both a participant and a leader of Bible classes. And we teachers tend to select topics for these classes and cover the same old stories over and over and over again. Now that's fine, but I can sometimes tell you that it can be a little less than interesting. So what I want to do with the dozen or so lessons in this series is to find the obscure, the amazing, and the downright strange facts in the Bible and have a little discussion about them. So I came up with the idea of calling this class Obscure, Amazing, and Downright Strange Things in the Bible, but instead I was convinced to call it I'll Bet You Didn't Know. And I know that putting that kind of challenge in front of you might make you want to come back just to show me that, yes, I knew that, or to come to the lessons to discuss things off the beaten path a little bit. Please know that I am not a betting man. I have not lost one single dollar on any kind of bet to my knowledge. I don't play cards for money. I've only been to one horse race, the Kentucky Derby, which is a story that I'll tell you about in a later lesson. And I don't want to upset any of my religious friends by starting with, I'll bet you didn't know, because we know Christians ought not to bet. But this is just in jest. I'm also hoping that some of the things I bring up to you, you do know. Today's lesson is called A Rock That Followed People Around. Have you ever heard this Bible story? I'll bet you haven't. Now, we've all been there, right? A car, a long trip, 3 kids strapped in the back seat. I was born in 1955, and my parents had 4 daughters younger than me, so everywhere we went, there were 5 of us kids, 5 of us. In the 1960s, my dad was driving a very old but well-maintained 1956 Chevy Bel Air. And at the time, there were no seat belts, and car seats had not yet been invented. The youngest of my sisters always rode in the front seat with Mom and Dad. So there were 4 of us kids in the back seat. Fortunately, the Bel Air had a huge shelf just on top of the back seat, just under the window. So we kids always fought who would get to go up there and lay as we go down the road. Air conditioning had not yet been invented, or at least we were too poor to afford it. So it was always extremely hot in the back seat, and my mom and dad both smoked. It was a miserable time for all of us. What we want, more than anything at this time in a car with kids on a long trip, is peace and tranquility. But according to that great philosopher, Mick Jagger, and the Rolling Stones, get it? Rolling Stones? Yeah. Well, you can't always get what you want. Oh, you can wish for it. You can beg the kids to be nice to one another. You can try to bribe them or even threaten to take away something they really, really want. But none of that does any good. You want tranquility. You want peace and quiet. But what you get is something completely different. Bickering, loud, noisy, angry, crying kids, frustrated at how long the trip is taking. They're thirsty. They're hungry. They ask over and over again, are we there yet? They need to go to the bathroom. No one is happy, especially the 2 people in the front seat. You might even begin to wonder, why did God put me in this position? Well, there was another group of people in the Bible who felt very much like you when you're with these kids. Moses found himself sitting in the driver's seat. But instead of 2 or 3 kids in the back seat, Exodus 12:37 says there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. So a very generous estimate starts at about 1 million people. Imagine the responsibility that Moses was feeling, leading 1 million people out into the wilderness and not even being sure of what his destination was. It did not matter that the crowd had just witnessed several days of God's awesome power and might during the plagues. They knew God's power ultimately is what freed them to leave. It did not matter that their God was leading them and sustaining them on their journey. It did not matter that their chosen leader already asked God to open the Red Sea to allow them to walk across on dry ground and escape the Egyptian army. The Bible says at Rephidim, they quarreled with Moses. Really, it should have said they complained like children in the back seat of a car on a long road trip. There's no water. Hey, I'm thirsty. It's too hot in here. We've headed out into the desert. Moses, do you even have a road map, or do you have Google? I can't get a connection for my iPhone. Well, I doubt anybody said that. And they were in need of water, as they found themselves on the very edge of a very dry desert. So they were doing just what the kids in the back seat do, and they started to quarrel with Moses. Water, we need water, and there's nothing in front of us but sand. Moses, why did you bring us out here? Don't you see that this was not a well thought out plan? Where is the Lord that you told us about? He is not here. Well, God heard their complaining, and he used it to show them the wonder of his mighty power. He told Moses, go to a rock in Sinai near Mount Horeb that I will show you. Stand in front of the rock and strike the rock with your shepherd's crook. And stand back, it's going to get wet very, very fast. Sure enough, water poured from the rock, and all the people at once were happy and dancing. Moses, though, called the place Marabah Massa. Together, these two words mean quarreling and testing. They quarreled with Moses, and they tested God, and God was not very happy with their testing, just as we are not always happy when our kids test us in the back seat of a car. Now, the interesting thing is that even today, the Jews have a tradition that says after Moses caused the rock to spout water, that the very rock somehow was able to follow the group around for all the time they were wandering in the wilderness. Here's the verse in the Targum Jonathan on Numbers, which is a kind of paraphrase of the Torah. From the time that the rock in Rephidim gave them water, it was made later to give them overflowing brooks, and it went up to the tops of the mountains and went down with them into the valleys. It was truly a moving rock. The tradition says the rock actually moved on its own. It was not placed in a wagon and carted around. It followed Moses and the group, no matter where they went. Have you ever heard of rocks that move on their own? And no, I'm not talking about musical groups like the Rolling Stones or Sly and the Family Stone or the Stone Temple Pilots, but real, actual rocks that move. Impossible, right? Well, maybe not so impossible. I'm willing to bet that you never heard about moving rocks in the Mojave Desert near Death Valley. This is no joke. Honestly, you can see here in this image that these rocks have trails when they move. And, as you can see, they move long distances. This is no made-up story. You can check it on Snopes.com. And lest you think that it's only that one rock, think again. There are many of them, all different shapes and sizes, and they don't always follow a curved shape. path, as you can see here. Do you know what's causing the rocks to move? No one knew up until about 2013. Someone went and placed a camera out there to see what was going on, and they found the cause. It has nothing to do with people pushing them, or earthquakes, or magnetism, or little green people from the moon. It's not aliens that are causing them to move. I'll give you some clues to see if you can figure out what the causes are for these rocks moving. First, could the wind have caused this? Well, no. There are no wind that's strong enough, which occurs in the Death Valley, to move these rocks like that. Wind alone could not accomplish this feat. Would it help you to know that the rocks always slide downhill just a tiny bit? Yes, but the slope is rather minor, and friction would not allow the rocks to move this distance over time. How about if I mentioned the movement only seems to occur in the winter? Ah, now you're getting closer. There is often ice that forms in Death Valley in the wintertime. Ice sometimes forms around and under the rocks, and because of it lying on a gentle downhill slope, the ice removes much of the friction that keeps it in place. Eventually, they begin moving and leaving a trail, as you can see here. And at that point, when they're floating on ice, wind can push them around and make them change course. But the rock we're talking about, the rock at Maraba and Massa, was different. It moved with its own volition, and it seemed to follow the Jews from place to place, according to the Jewish tradition. The Jews' description of the rock is that it looked somewhat like a large beehive. It had many holes all around it, and from each of the holes water poured out. As they moved during their long wandering, the rock was with them all the time, giving them water. When their tabernacle was dismantled and the group began to move, the rock actually rolled with them until camp was set up at their next stop. It was a moving rock that didn't need ice or wind for it to move. According to the Jewish tradition, God was making the rock move with them. The same story is repeated in the Midrash on Numbers. In this story, the rock was referred to as the well because of its life-giving water, and the Midrash says that it moved with them from campsite to campsite. It rolled along as it went, and it would roll into the court of the tabernacle and remain there until they moved again. Now back to Moses. 1 million or so angry Jews demanding water. They were in a dry and parched desert, and it looked to them as if they were headed in deeper. They searched, but they couldn't find water. Do you know the word rock is a favorite word used by Moses for the Lord? To him, the Lord was a solid rock. It was also used by others, including King David and the prophet Isaiah, to represent the steadfastness and the trustworthiness of the Lord. Moses prayed to God and was told to take the large group deeper into the desert, all the way to Mount Horeb, what we call Mount Sinai today. So here is Moses standing before a lifeless stone with no water in sight. Moses knew that he was told to take the shepherd's crook and strike the rock. But notice what else Moses was told. The Bible says a curious thing. God said to Moses, I will stand before you, and you shall strike the rock. Moses must have thought, Lord, are you going to position yourself directly in front of me so that when I bring my shepherd's crook down, I will strike you first, and then I will strike the rock? Okay, here goes. It will not be until many years later, when the Apostle Paul comes, that we will understand really just what happened. Now, I'm willing to bet that you did not know that Jesus was present when Moses struck the rock. Remember the statement, I will stand before you and you will strike it? So the implication is, according to the Apostle Paul, when Moses struck the rock, Jesus, as an unseen form, stood between him and the rock, so that when Moses struck the rock, his staff passed through Jesus, and then it hit the rock, the physical rock. In a sense, Jesus was submitting to the rod of judgment. He took the punishment that the Israelites deserved. Now let me ask you a question. What was it that produced the gushing water? It wasn't the rock with a little r, but the rock with a capital R. It was Jesus. He once said of himself, I am the true water of life. Come drink of me, and you will have life everlasting. After this realization and Paul's comment on what was happening back in the story Moses was telling, I now think about the rock from which flowed water, and I know that Jesus in a pre-incarnate, invisible form was there when Moses hit the rock. Moses hit him first. Jesus, even then, was doing his redemptive function. It was him who provided the water and not the physical rock. Think about this. We know the story. Later at Kadesh Barnea, God is told by Moses, the people need water again, Lord. What do I do? This time, Moses was told to go to the rock and speak to it. Don't hit it again, but speak to it. But we know that instead of speaking to the rock, he hit the rock as he had done before. Now, I have often wondered why God was so angry with Moses for striking the rock a second time. And why would he tell Moses not to strike it, but to speak to it anyway? What logical reason could there have been for that? Well, here's what I think. I believe that Jesus had already been struck for their sins at Rephidim, and being the perfect one to take away those sins, the first time he did not need to be struck again. And perhaps that is why God was angry with Moses' decision to strike the rock again at Kadesh. Thankfully, I know the rest of the story, that Jesus eventually did come as a living and breathing human being, born to Mary and Joseph, sinless. He showed us the Father as none had done before. Sinless, he was struck yet again as the nails were entered into his hands on the cross for each and every one of us. Thank you for tuning into this lesson. There are probably about 11 more that will follow this one, and I hope that you are encouraged to check them out. And we should be placing one of those out there a week, if not the whole bunch of them. Thank you very much for tuning in, and God bless you.